My name is Jackson Miller, but everyone calls me Jack. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but what happened in Bloodhowl Valley changed my life forever. Before I start, I should tell you a bit about myself. I'm a Vietnam vet turned wildlife photographer. The war, well, it left its marks on me, both inside and out. The nightmares, the jumping at loud noises, the cold sweats, they were all part of my daily life. But then, I met Rebecca, and everything changed. Rebecca was different from anyone I'd ever known. A high school teacher with a love for spooky stories and local legends, she brought light back into my dark world. Her smile could make me forget about all the horrible things I'd seen in the war. We got married 2 years ago, and she helped me turn my love for photography into a real job. Last month, we found this old RV, a 1970 Winnebago Brave, for sale at a surprisingly low price. The owner, this nervous guy, practically gave it away. I should have known something was wrong when I found those weird claw marks under it, but I was too excited about our upcoming trip to care. You see, Rebecca had heard stories about Bloodhowl Valley in West Virginia. According to her research, people had been disappearing there for years, especially during the harvest moon in September. Being the curious souls we were, we decided to check it out. Rebecca wanted to study the local folklore, and I wanted to photograph the wildlife. If only we'd paid attention to the signs. If only we'd listened to the warnings. But how could we have known? How could anyone have known what was waiting for us in those ancient Appalachian woods? What I'm about to tell you happened over 5 nights during the harvest moon of 1973. Even now, as I write this, my hands shake remembering those glowing eyes in the darkness, the howls that sounded almost human, and the terrible choice I had to make to save the person I loved most in the world. This is our story, and I swear every word of it is true. It all started on a sunny Monday morning when we drove into the small town near Bloodhowl Valley. Something felt off right from the start. The streets were nearly empty, and the few people outside hurried away when they saw our RV. Even the dogs were acting strange, barking and growling at nothing. We stopped at Joe's Diner for breakfast, and that's where we first met Carl Winston. He was a big guy with a scruffy beard and worn-out hunting clothes. He overheard us asking the waitress about the valley and offered to be our guide. "Folks around here don't go to that valley much," Carl said, stirring his coffee. "Especially not during harvest moon." When Rebecca asked why, he just shrugged and said something about wild animals. The waitress, an old lady named Martha, grabbed my arm when we were leaving. Her eyes were wide with fear. "Don't go there," she whispered. "Not now. The moon is almost full." Before I could ask what she meant, she hurried back to the kitchen. We followed Carl's truck up the winding mountain road to the ranger station. That's when things started getting weirder. First, we found a dead deer by the road. Now, I'd seen plenty of roadkill before, but this was different. The way it was torn apart, it didn't look like the work of any normal animal I knew. While Rebecca was registering us at the station, I noticed something under our RV, fresh claw marks, deeper than the old ones. They looked new, but how? We'd been driving all morning. Carl helped us set up camp in a clearing. As he was leaving, he gave us his radio frequency just in case, and said he lived in a cabin nearby. The sun was setting, and the woods were getting dark. That's when we heard it, a howl that made the hair on my neck stand up. It wasn't a normal wolf howl. It sounded almost like words. Rebecca squeezed my hand. "Jack, maybe Martha was right about the harvest moon." I laughed it off, but I also checked my hidden gun compartment in the RV. Old habits from Vietnam, I guess. As darkness fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the trees. If only I'd known then what was hiding in those woods. If only I'd listened to my gut and driven away right that moment. But we stayed, and that was just the beginning of our nightmare. The first night in Bloodhowl Valley had only just begun, and things were about to get much, much worse. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The sounds from the woods weren't normal. In Vietnam, I'd learned to tell the difference between natural jungle noises and something dangerous lurking around. These sounds, they were definitely the dangerous kind. Around midnight, Rebecca shook me awake. "Jack, look," she whispered, pointing out the RV window. There, at the edge of our campsite, were two glowing eyes, about 7 feet off the ground, too high for any normal wolf or bear. When I shined my flashlight there, whatever it was disappeared, leaving only massive footprints in the dirt. The next morning, I measured those prints, 28 inches long. That's more than twice the size of a normal wolf's paw. While I was studying them, our radio crackled to life. Instead of Carl's voice, we heard this deep, growling sound, almost like words, but not quite. Rebecca found something too. In the woods nearby, she discovered an old campsite. Everything was torn up, tents ripped to shreds, camping gear scattered everywhere. But what really got to me were the Polaroid photos lying in the dirt. They showed dark, tall figures standing between trees, watching the camera. On the back of one photo, someone had written, "They're getting closer. They can speak to us." I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but our RV wouldn't start. The battery was dead, even though it had been fine the day before. I radioed Carl for help. When he arrived, he seemed nervous, kept looking over his shoulder at the trees. "You need to leave," he said quietly while pretending to check the engine. "Tonight, before moonrise. They know you're here now." "Who knows?" I asked. Carl just shook his head. Not who, what. His hands were shaking as he worked on the RV. "There's something I need to tell you both, but not here. Come to my cabin before dark. And whatever you do, don't..." That's when we heard it, a howl so loud it shook the RV's windows. Carl's face went white. Without another word, he ran to his truck and drove off, leaving us with a half-fixed engine and more questions than answers. Rebecca spent the afternoon reading some old local history book she'd brought. "Jack," she said, her voice trembling, "according to these Cherokee legends, this valley was sealed off hundreds of years ago because of something they called the people who walk like wolves. As the sun started to set, we had to make a choice. Try to reach Carl's cabin before dark, or stay in our broken-down RV. Either way, I had a feeling our second night in Bloodhowl Valley was going to be even worse than the first. Looking back now, I realized we had no idea just how bad things were about to get. We decided to try reaching Carl's cabin. I grabbed my camera, a flashlight, and my hidden gun. Something told me we'd need it. The walk was supposed to take 30 minutes, but it felt like hours. The forest was too quiet, like all the animals were hiding. Halfway there, Rebecca stopped suddenly. "Jack, did you hear that?" she whispered. I heard it too, twigs snapping, coming from all around us. My combat training kicked in. We were being surrounded. Then we saw them, dark shapes moving between the trees, much bigger than any wolf I'd ever seen. They walked on 2 legs, like people, but everything else about them was wrong. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, just like what we'd seen last night. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Rebecca's hand. We sprinted toward where Carl's cabin should be. The creatures followed, but they weren't just chasing us. They were herding us, driving us in a specific direction. We burst into a clearing, and there was Carl's cabin. But something was wrong. The door was wide open, swinging in the wind. Inside, everything was torn apart, like a tornado had hit it. And on the walls, there were claw marks everywhere. "Jack!" Rebecca's voice shook as she pointed to Carl's journal on the floor. The last entry read, "They're changing me. Every full moon, it gets worse. I can hear them in my head now. God help anyone who comes to this valley." Suddenly, the radio in Carl's cabin crackled to life. Through the static, we heard a voice, Carl's voice, but different, almost like a growl. "I tried to warn you. It's too late now. They want you to join the pack." That's when we saw him through the window. Carl was standing at the edge of the clearing, but he wasn't Carl anymore. His face was changing, stretching into something between human and wolf. Behind him stood the largest creature I'd ever seen, the Alpha. It had to be 9 feet tall, with silver-gray fur and eyes that looked ancient and intelligent. The Alpha spoke, not with words, but directly into our minds. "Welcome to our valley. You can't leave now. The change has already begun." I looked at Rebecca and my heart stopped. Her eyes, they were starting to glow just like theirs. We were trapped in the cabin, surrounded by these creatures, and my wife was starting to change into one of them. I had to think fast. The sun had set, the harvest moon was rising, and I knew our third night in Bloodhowl Valley would be the worst one yet. But I wasn't going to let them take Rebecca, not without a fight. I barricaded us inside Carl's cabin, pushing furniture against the doors and windows. Rebecca was getting worse. She was shaking, and her skin felt hot, like she had a fever. In Carl's desk, I found something that gave me hope: a box of silver bullets and an old leather journal. The journal was written by Carl's grandfather. It explained everything: how the pack had lived in this valley for hundreds of years, how they could change people by biting them, and most importantly, how they were weak against silver. Each full moon made their power stronger, but the harvest moon was special. That's when they could change anyone they wanted. "Jack," Rebecca called out weakly, "I can hear them in my head. They're telling me to open the door." Her eyes would glow for a few seconds, then return to normal. She was fighting it. Outside, the pack circled the cabin. I could see their shadows through the windows. The Alpha's voice kept pushing into my mind. "She belongs to us now. You can join her or watch her become one of us." Then Carl's voice shouted from outside, still sounding half-human. "The silver! Use the silver! It's the only way to save her!" There was a horrible howl, then sounds of fighting. Carl was trying to help us, fighting against his own pack. I loaded the silver bullets into my gun, just as the pack started breaking through the windows. Their claws tore through the wood like it was paper. Rebecca screamed, not in fear, but in pain. The change was getting stronger. I had to make a choice: try to fight our way back to the RV, or stay and fight in the cabin. Either way, we had to move fast. The harvest moon was getting higher, and with every minute, Rebecca was slipping away from me. Then I remembered something from Carl's grandfather's journal. There was an old Cherokee cave nearby with symbols that could protect against the pack's power. If I could just get Rebecca there before the change was complete. The Alpha seemed to read my thoughts. The whole cabin shook as he slammed against the walls. "You can't save her," his voice growled in my head. "The harvest moon has chosen. By sunrise, she will run with us." I looked at my wife, the love of my life, as she fought against turning into one of these creatures. The wood of the cabin was cracking. We had minutes, maybe seconds, before they broke through. I gripped my gun loaded with silver bullets, helped Rebecca to her feet, and got ready to make our last stand. One way or another, this would end tonight. What happened next still haunts my nightmares. The cabin walls finally broke. Everything happened so fast. The pack poured in from all sides, but I was ready. The silver bullets worked better than I expected. Each shot made them howl in pain and back away. "Run!" Carl screamed from outside. He was still fighting the change, his face caught between human and wolf. "The cave is half a mile north. I'll hold them off." I grabbed Rebecca, who could barely walk now. Her skin was burning hot, and her eyes kept changing color. "Stay with me, honey," I begged as we ran into the dark forest. Behind us, Carl's screams turned into howls. The Alpha's voice boomed in our heads. "You can't run from what you're becoming." The trees themselves seemed to bend toward us, and the wind howled like 1,000 wolves. Rebecca stumbled. "Jack, I can't. They're in my head." Her fingers were starting to curve into claws. I had to practically carry her now. Then I saw it, the cave entrance. Just like in the journal. Ancient Cherokee symbols were carved around it, but between us and the cave stood 3 of the largest dogmen, with the Alpha right behind them. "Enough games," the Alpha growled, now speaking out loud. His voice sounded like rocks grinding together. "She is ours. The harvest moon demands new blood." That's when something unexpected happened. Rebecca straightened up, her eyes glowing bright, but instead of attacking me, she turned toward the Alpha. "No," she said, her voice a mixture of growl and human speech. "I won't be like you." I didn't understand at first, but then I remembered what Carl's journal said. Some people could fight the change if their will was strong enough. Rebecca, my brave Rebecca, was fighting back. The Alpha roared in fury and charged at us. I raised my gun, but I was out of silver bullets. Everything seemed lost, but then Carl burst from the trees, fully changed into a wolfman, but somehow still himself. He slammed into the Alpha, giving us our chance. "The cave," he shouted in a raspy howl. "The symbols. They'll break the curse." We ran for the cave entrance. Behind us, the sound of Carl fighting the Alpha was terrible to hear. Just as we reached the symbols, I felt the Alpha's claws grab my shoulder. The Alpha's claws dug into my shoulder, but Rebecca grabbed me and pulled me into the cave. The moment we crossed the line of Cherokee symbols, something amazing happened. It was like an invisible wall slammed down behind us. The Alpha howled in rage, unable to cross the threshold. Inside the cave, Rebecca collapsed. She was shaking all over, but something was different. The cave symbols were glowing faintly, and where their light touched her, the change seemed to slow down. "Jack," she whispered, "it's getting clearer. Their voices, they're fading." But our relief didn't last long. The Alpha's voice echoed through the cave. "You cannot hide forever. The symbols will only protect you until sunrise. Then she will be one of us completely." He was right. Through the cave entrance, I could see the harvest moon climbing higher. We had maybe 6 hours until dawn. Rebecca was still changing, just slower now. Her hands were half claws, and her eyes kept shifting between their normal brown and a wolf-like yellow. Then we heard Carl's voice, weak and raspy. "The back of the cave. There's more." He was lying wounded outside, still trying to help us. Before he could finish, the Alpha struck him down. Holding Rebecca, I moved deeper into the cave. My flashlight beam showed more symbols on the walls, different from the ones at the entrance. There were pictures showing people fighting wolf creatures, and in the center, a large drawing of a moon with a line crossed through it. Rebecca squeezed my hand suddenly. "Jack, look!" She pointed to writing below the moon picture. Even half changed, she could still read the old text. "It's a ritual on a way to break the curse. But," she paused, fighting another wave of pain, "it has to be done at the exact moment the harvest moon starts to set." Outside, the pack was going crazy, throwing themselves against the invisible barrier. The Alpha's fury made the whole cave shake. "You'll never survive until moonset," he snarled in our minds. "The change will take her first, and she'll tear you apart herself." I looked at my watch. 4 hours until the moon would start to set. 4 hours to figure out this ritual. 4 hours to save my wife. Rebecca's eyes met mine, now more wolf than human. "Jack," she whimpered, "whatever happens, don't let me hurt you. Promise me." I held her close as she shuddered through another wave of the change. Outside, the pack howled at the harvest moon, waiting for us to either come out or for the protection to fail. We had one chance to save Rebecca, but time was running out. The next few hours were the hardest of my life. Rebecca was fighting the change with everything she had, but it was getting harder. Sometimes she'd growl and try to attack me, then cry when she came back to herself. I had to tie her hands with my belt, her idea, not mine. While she fought the curse, I studied the cave drawings. The ritual seemed simple enough. We needed to use silver to draw certain symbols on the ground, and Rebecca had to stand in the middle when the moon started to set. But there was a catch. The Alpha had to be nearby for it to work. It was like the ritual needed his power to break the curse. "Jack," Rebecca said during a clear moment, "there's something else. The pictures, they show two people. One has to sacrifice something to save the other." Before she could explain more, she screamed in pain. The change was getting stronger. Her face was starting to reshape, and fur was growing on her arms. We were running out of time. Outside, the Alpha hadn't given up. "You can't save her," his voice boomed in our heads. "The harvest moon has chosen. The change is almost complete." Then we heard Carl's voice again, very weak. "There's another way. The Alpha, he's lying. If you kill him, before the change is complete." A horrible sound followed, and Carl went silent. But he'd given us an idea. The ritual didn't need the Alpha alive, it just needed him there. I checked my pockets and found one last silver bullet I'd forgotten about. One chance. Rebecca looked at me with eyes that were almost completely wolf-like now. "We have to go out there," she said, fighting to speak clearly. I can feel when the moon will set. It's soon." I untied her hands. She was right. We had maybe 15 minutes before the moon started to set. Just enough time to set up the ritual and face the Alpha. As we stepped toward the cave entrance, Rebecca grabbed my arm. For a moment, she was completely herself again. "Jack, whatever happens, I love you." Then we stepped out of the cave, into the moonlight, to face the pack and their Alpha. What happened next would decide everything. Rebecca's fate, our future, and whether we'd leave this valley alive or as part of the pack. The final battle in Bloodhowl Valley was about to begin. The moment we stepped out of the cave, everything exploded into chaos. The pack surrounded us, but they didn't attack. They were waiting for the Alpha's command. He stood there, massive and terrifying, his silver-gray fur glowing in the moonlight. "Foolish humans," he growled. "You could have joined us willingly. Now watch as she becomes one of us forever." Rebecca fell to her knees, the change hitting her harder in the moonlight. I had to act fast. Using a silver knife I'd found in the cave, I started drawing the symbols on the ground, just like in the pictures. The Alpha watched, almost amused. "Your human magic can't stop what's meant to be," he snarled. But I noticed something. He seemed nervous about the symbols I was drawing. Then I saw it. While the Alpha was focused on me, Rebecca was fighting through her pain to draw more symbols behind him. Smart girl, she was trapping him in a circle. We just had to complete it before the moon started setting. Suddenly, Carl's broken body moved. He wasn't dead after all. "Now, Jack," he yelled, using his last strength to leap at the Alpha. "The bullet! Use it!" Everything happened at once. The Alpha threw Carl aside and charged at me. Rebecca screamed, not in fear, but in rage, and jumped between us, more wolf than human now. I raised my gun with the last silver bullet, but I couldn't shoot. The Alpha and Rebecca were rolling around, fighting, and I couldn't risk hitting her. The moon was starting to set. We had seconds left. Then Rebecca did something incredible. She looked at me with her wolf eyes and smiled. My Rebecca was still in there. She held the Alpha tight and yelled, "Do it!" I took the shot. The silver bullet went through both of them. The Alpha's howl shook the whole valley. The ritual symbols began to glow as the moon started to set. Rebecca was lying there, blood on her chest, the change frozen halfway. "Jack," she whispered, "finish it. The words, say them." I read the Cherokee words written in the cave, my voice shaking. The Alpha was dying, his power fading. All around us, his pack began to change back into regular wolves. Rebecca's body started glowing with the same light as the symbols. The wolf features were fading, but she wasn't moving. "Please," I begged, holding her, "please don't leave me." Rebecca's eyes fluttered open. They were her normal brown again. No more wolf glow. The bullet had gone through her shoulder, missing her heart. The Alpha wasn't so lucky. As he died, his entire pack transformed into regular wolves and ran off into the forest. Carl was still alive, barely. The Alpha's death had turned him back to human, too. "Thank you," he whispered, before closing his eyes for the last time. He died as himself, not as a monster. We made it back to our RV just as the sun was rising. Rebecca was weak but alive, and completely human again. Well, almost. The curse left its mark on her. Every full moon, her eyes still glow a little, and she can hear wolves howling from miles away. But she never changes. The ritual made sure of that. As we drove away from Bloodhowl Valley, Rebecca squeezed my hand. "The wolves?" she said quietly. "They're saying thank you. They were trapped here, too, under the Alpha's power. Now they're free." That was 2 years ago. We never went back to that valley, but sometimes on full moon nights, Rebecca stands outside and looks toward the Appalachian Mountains. Sometimes she even answers when the wolves howl. We found out later that every few decades, someone like the Alpha would rise up and start turning people into wolf creatures. The Cherokee had created those symbols in the cave to help fight them. Now the valley is quiet again, waiting for the next time. People ask me if I'm afraid of another Alpha showing up someday. I just show them my camera bag, the one with silver bullets hidden in a secret pocket. Rebecca and I will be ready. You might not believe my story. That's okay. But next harvest moon, if you're camping in the Appalachians and hear wolves howling words in your mind, pack up and drive away. Or you might find out for yourself what's really hiding in Bloodhowl Valley. My name is Diana O'Reilly, and I'm 16 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened during those 5 terrifying nights at Mount Baker back in December 1965. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see it all. The snow, the blood, and those hungry eyes in the darkness. But I need to share this story. People should know what's really out there in those mountains. It started like any other business trip with my dad. He owned O'Reilly Logging Company with his best friend, Peter Walsh. Dad always said I should learn about the family business, so he'd take me along sometimes. This time, we were headed to check out a new logging area near Mount Baker. The Walshes came too, Peter, his wife Maria, who's a nurse, and their son Kevin. He's 14 and usually pretty annoying, but after what we went through together, well, that's getting ahead of myself. We took our big RV, this 1964 Dodge Travco that Dad had fixed up for winter trips. It was like a house on wheels, with bunk beds, a tiny kitchen, and lots of emergency supplies. Dad always said better safe than sorry. I guess he was right about that, even though nothing could have really prepared us for what happened. It was a cold afternoon when we started up the mountain road. I was in the back, playing with my new camera. Photography's kind of my thing. Kevin was being his usual self, complaining about no radio signal, while our parents talked about boring business stuff up front. Everything seemed so normal. But then the temperature dropped. Not just regular winter cold, but the kind that makes your bones hurt. The sky turned this weird gray color I'd never seen before, and that's when Dad said something that still gives me chills. This isn't natural weather. He had no idea how right he was. None of us knew that we were driving straight into a nightmare, or that by the end of those 5 days, our lives would change forever. And not everyone would make it back down that mountain. That first evening started getting weird real fast. We parked the RV in a clearing near where Dad wanted to start logging. I was taking pictures of the sunset when Kevin came running back from exploring. His face was white as the snow. "You guys need to see this," he said, his voice shaky. About 50 feet from our full, we found it, a dead deer. But this wasn't like any normal dead animal. It looked empty, like something had carefully taken out its insides. There was barely any blood, and the strangest part? The snow around it was completely untouched. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, nothing. Maybe it was wolves, Mrs. Walsh suggested. But Dad shook his head. He'd been a Marine before becoming a logger, and he knew about predators. "Wolves don't hunt like this," he said quietly. The temperature kept dropping. Our thermometer showed -20 DU4F, which made no sense for that time of year. Inside the RV, we could hear the wind picking up, but it didn't sound right. It was like the wind was, whispering. That night, none of us slept well. The RV's metal walls usually made me feel safe, but not this time. Every few minutes, we'd hear something moving outside, soft crunches in the snow, circling our RV. Dad kept his rifle close. telling us it was just animals curious about our vehicle. But then we heard it, a sound that made my skin crawl. It was like someone dragging their nails across the RV's roof, slow and deliberate. Kevin started crying, trying to hide it in his pillow. His mom hugged him tight while Mr. Walsh and my dad checked every window and door lock twice. I pulled out my camera, thinking maybe I could catch whatever it was on film. Through the small window, I saw something that still haunts my dreams. Just for a second, in the moonlight, a tall, skinny shadow moved past. It walked like a person, but wrong. Like its legs were too long, bent in places they shouldn't bend. "Dad," I whispered, "I think we should leave tomorrow." He nodded, looking more worried than I'd ever seen him. "First light," he promised. "We'll head back first light." But when morning came, we discovered that leaving wouldn't be so simple. The mountain had other plans for us, and that was just the beginning of our nightmare. The next morning felt wrong from the moment we woke up. The RV's windows were covered in frost, not on the outside, but on the inside. When Dad tried to start the engine, it just made this awful whining noise and died. That's when we noticed the claw marks on the roof. They were deep, like something had tried to dig through the metal. "Everyone stay calm," Dad said. But I could tell he was scared too. He and Mr. Walsh went outside to check the engine, while Mrs. Walsh made hot chocolate to keep our minds off things. That's when our old CB radio suddenly crackled to life. At first, it was just static, but then we heard voices, old voices, like from an old movie. They were calling for help, talking about something hunting them. The weird part? The transmission was dated December 1938. Kevin and I looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. How could we be hearing something from almost 30 years ago? Then Kevin started acting strange. He said he needed some air, and before anyone could stop him, he ran outside. Mrs. Walsh screamed for him to come back, but he disappeared into the trees. We spent 2 terrifying hours looking for him. When he finally came back, something was different about him. His eyes looked empty, and he wouldn't tell us where he'd been. "I'm just hungry," was all he kept saying. So hungry. That afternoon, I was taking pictures of the woods when I saw it through my camera lens. Standing between 2 trees was this thing. It must have been 9 feet tall, skinny as a skeleton, with skin that looked like old gray ice. For a second, it turned its head and looked right at me. Its eyes were black holes in its face, and its mouth, oh God, its mouth had too many teeth. I dropped my camera and ran back to the RV. When Dad and Mr. Walsh tried to drive us out of there, something weird happened. The road we came in on, it wasn't there anymore. Just trees and more trees, like the road had never existed. "That's impossible," Mr. Walsh kept saying. "We drove in this way. I know we did." As the day got darker, it got colder too. Mr. Walsh started complaining about being hungry, really hungry. Nothing seemed to fill him up. Mrs. Walsh tried to check if he was sick, but he wouldn't let her near him. His fingernails started looking longer, and his skin was getting pale, almost gray. We were all trapped in that RV, watching Mr. Walsh change, listening to those strange sounds outside, and knowing that something horrible was waiting for us in those woods. That night changed everything. The snow started falling harder than I'd ever seen, but it wasn't normal snow. It fell in weird patterns, almost like it was trying to trap us. The temperature on our thermometer just kept dropping until it couldn't go any lower. Mr. Walsh got worse by the hour. His skin turned almost white, and his eyes, they started turning black, just like that thing I'd seen in the woods. He couldn't stop shaking, and kept talking about how hungry he was. Mrs. Walsh tried to help him, using all her nurse training, but nothing worked. "Peter, please," she kept begging him. "Let me help you." Around midnight, it happened. Mr. Walsh started screaming, not like a person, but like an animal in pain. His fingers were stretching longer, his teeth getting sharper. Dad grabbed his rifle, but Mrs. Walsh stood in front of her husband. "He's still Peter," she yelled. "He's still my Peter." But she was wrong. In just seconds, Mr. Walsh or what used to be him, lunged at Kevin. Mrs. Walsh pushed her son out of the way, but that meant she took the hit instead. I'll never forget her scream, or the way Kevin cried out, "Mom!" Dad grabbed Kevin and me, pushing us toward the back of the RV. Mr. Walsh, the thing he'd become, was crouched over Mrs. Walsh, and I had to close my eyes. The sounds. I can't even describe them. "The cave," Dad suddenly shouted. I saw a cave nearby. When I say run, you two run there as fast as you can. Don't look back. We waited by the RV's back door, hearts pounding. Dad fired his rifle into the air, and the thing that was Mr. Walsh looked up. That's when Dad yelled, "Run!" Kevin and I ran through the snow, trying not to slip. Behind us, we could hear Dad shooting and something screaming. That awful, hungry scream. The cave wasn't far, but in that blizzard, every step felt like forever. We made it inside just as Dad caught up with us. He was bleeding from his arm, but alive. As we went deeper into the cave, our flashlights showed something on the walls. Old paintings. They showed tall, skinny creatures hunting people, and people turning into those creatures. "Dad," I whispered, "I think I know what happened to Mr. Walsh. I think I know what's hunting us." In the cave, Dad's flashlight showed more of those ancient paintings. There were pictures of these tall, skinny monsters that the paintings called wendigo. But what scared me most were the drawings showing people turning into these creatures, just like what happened to Mr. Walsh. "I've heard stories," Dad said quietly, "from the local tribes. They warned us not to log here. Said this was sacred ground, that something old and hungry lived in these mountains. I should have listened." Kevin hadn't said a word since we left his mom behind. He just sat there, hugging his knees, shivering, but not from the cold. When I touched his hand, it felt like ice. "I can feel it," he whispered suddenly. "Ever since I went into the woods, it's like there's something inside me, trying to get out. I'm so hungry, Diana. So hungry it hurts." Dad looked at Kevin with tears in his eyes. We all knew what that meant. Kevin was starting to change too. Just then, we heard something outside the cave. Something big. The creature that used to be Mr. Walsh was there, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood something much worse, the original wendigo. It was huge, like a tree made of bones and gray skin. Its eyes glowed in the dark, and when it smiled, all those teeth. But the worst part was its voice. It could talk, and it sounded like 100 people speaking at once. "Your kind was warned," it said. "This mountain is sacred. Your greed woke me, and now you must pay the price." It reached out with its long, bony fingers, and suddenly, I couldn't move. It was like being frozen in ice. The creature grabbed me, pulling me away from Dad and Kevin. "Choose, human," it told my dad. "Save your daughter or save the boy. But you cannot save both. The hunger must be fed." I could see Dad looking at the ancient weapons drawn on the cave walls, spears and arrows marked with special symbols. There was something about them, something important. But would he figure it out in time? And even if he did, could he really choose between saving me or Kevin? The storm outside got stronger, and Kevin's eyes were getting darker by the minute. Time was running out for all of us. Dad's eyes moved between me, Kevin, and those cave paintings. Suddenly, his face changed, like he'd figured something out. Near the cave paintings, there were old wooden spears with strange marks carved into them. Dad grabbed one, and I noticed his hands were shaking. "The paintings," he said. "Look at them carefully. The wendigo's weakness, it's not the weapons themselves, it's the sacrifice. A willing sacrifice, made out of love." The monster holding me laughed, a horrible sound like breaking ice. Smart human. But knowing the answer doesn't make the choice easier, does it? Kevin started screaming then. His fingers were getting longer, his skin turning gray. "Uncle Frank," he cried, using my dad's name, "please, I don't want to become one of them. I don't want to be like Dad." I'd never seen my father cry before that night. He looked at me, his eyes full of tears. "Diana, my brave girl, I need you to take care of yourself now. Remember everything I taught you." That's when I understood what he was going to do. "Daddy, no!" I screamed, but he was already moving. Dad ran straight at the big wendigo, the ancient spear held high. "A father's sacrifice," he shouted. The creature dropped me in surprise. Dad stabbed it with the spear, but at the same time, its claws. Its claws went right through him. There was a flash of blue light. The big wendigo screamed, a sound that shook the whole mountain. Kevin collapsed, the darkness leaving his eyes. The thing that used to be Mr. Walsh just crumbled into ice and snow. But Dad was lying in the snow, and there was so much blood. "Take care of each other," he whispered. "Get off this mountain. And Diana, keep that camera safe. People need to know." Those were his last words. The storm suddenly stopped. In the distance, we could hear helicopters. Somehow, Dad's sacrifice had broken the wendigo's power, at least for now. But as Kevin and I huddled together, waiting for rescue, I knew nothing would ever be the same. The rescue team found us just before dawn. They said, we were lucky. A passing pilot had spotted our RV through a break in the clouds. When they found us, Kevin and I were barely conscious, huddled together in that cave. But something wasn't right about the rescue team. As they loaded us into the helicopter, I noticed one of them staring too long at the mountain. His eyes had this hungry look, and his hands were shaking like Mr. Walsh's did at the beginning. They took us to the hospital in Seattle. Nobody believed our story, of course. They said we were confused from the cold and trauma. "They called it a tragic accident," said my dad, "and the Walshes must have gotten lost in the storm." But I had proof in my camera. The photos came out weird, though. In most of them, the wendigo looked like a blur or a shadow. But one picture was clear, the one of Mr. Walsh changing. I keep it hidden now, along with Dad's journal where I wrote everything down. It's been 2 months since then. Kevin lives with his grandparents now. We talk on the phone every week. He says he still feels hungry sometimes, not normal hungry, but that deep, scary hunger. It comes and goes, worse when he's angry or scared. I worry about him. As for me, I've changed too. I can sense things now. Sometimes, when I pass certain woods or mountains, I get this cold feeling, like something old and hungry is watching. Last week, I read about 3 hikers who went missing near Mount Baker. The newspaper said it was an avalanche, but I know better. The scariest part? That rescue team member I mentioned, the one with the hungry eyes? I saw him in the newspaper too. He quit his job right after our rescue and disappeared into the mountains. Sometimes at night, I think I can hear his voice in the wind, calling others to join him. Dad's sacrifice saved us that night, but it didn't end the wendigo. Nothing can, really. It's still up there, waiting. And sometimes, when it snows and the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear it whispering. The hunger never dies. My name is Rick Harrison. I've spent the last 15 years of my life pulling people out of trouble as a search and rescue officer, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened at the Grand Canyon last summer. Even now, my hands shake as I write this down, trying to make sense of those 6 nights at Point Sublime. I guess I should start from the beginning. My wife Emily and I had planned this trip for months. She's a geologist, you see, always excited about rocks and canyon formations. I used to tease her about how she could stare at a single rock for hours, but now I wish that's all we had done on that trip. We packed our 1992 Winnebago Chieftain with everything we might need. Emergency gear for my SAR days, enough food and water for 2 weeks, even though we planned to stay for 6 nights, and all of Emily's research equipment. The RV was specially built for rough terrain, with solar panels on top for backup power. I remember being proud of how prepared we were. Funny how that means nothing when you're facing something impossible. The day we arrived was unusually hot, even for June. The dashboard thermometer read 115 DU4F, and the air felt like it was coming straight from an oven. Things started going wrong almost immediately. First, our GPS started showing weird locations, places that didn't exist. Then the radio began picking up stations that shouldn't have been possible, playing music from the 1940s as clear as day. I remember Emily's face when we met Rangers Mike Townsend and Linda Cooper at the entrance point. Linda looked nervous, kept glancing at the canyon like she was expecting something. Mike, a tough old guy with weather-beaten skin, tried to talk us out of going to Point Sublime. That area's been having some issues, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. Maybe choose another viewpoint? But Emily was determined. She'd been studying unusual mineral formations in that area, and Point Sublime was perfect for her research. Besides, what could go wrong with two experienced rangers knowing our location? If only we'd listened to the warning signs. If only we'd paid attention to those ancient Native American symbols we passed, the ones that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. If only we'd wondered why no other tourists were headed to one of the most beautiful viewpoints in the Grand Canyon. But we didn't. We just drove our RV down that lonely road, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, completely unaware that we were driving straight into a nightmare that would change our lives forever. That first evening, as the sun set and painted the canyon walls in shades of red and purple, I saw something that didn't make sense, a formation of rocks that seemed to move when I blinked. Emily saw it too. We both pretended we hadn't. That was just the beginning. If I'd known what was waiting for us in that ancient canyon, I would have turned that RV around and never looked back. But I didn't. And now I have to tell this story, not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever disappeared in those red rocks. Because the Grand Canyon has secrets, ancient secrets, and some of them are finally ready to come out. That first night in the RV was when things really started getting strange. Emily and I had just finished setting up our camp at Point Sublime when we noticed how unusually quiet it was. Not the normal peaceful quiet of nature, this was different, like the whole canyon was holding its breath. We were making dinner when our watches stopped working. All of them, at exactly 3:33 p.m. Even our phones showed the same time, frozen. Emily tried to joke about it, saying maybe we'd found some kind of time-free zone. But I could tell she was worried too. The sunset that evening was wrong. I know that sounds crazy, but trust me, I've seen hundreds of sunsets at the Grand Canyon during my SAR days. This one seemed to last too long, and the colors were off. The red was too deep, almost like blood, and there were shadows moving in ways that shadows shouldn't move. "Rick," Emily called from outside. She was kneeling next to some rocks, her flashlight beam shaking slightly. "Come, look at this." I walked over, and what I saw made my stomach turn. The rock samples she'd collected just an hour ago were different. Not just their color or shape, they were actually different rocks. Emily swore she'd picked up regular sandstone, but these were black and seemed to have tiny patterns carved into them. That's when we heard it, a sound that still haunts my dreams. It started as a low hum, barely noticeable, but grew into something that sounded like singing, not human singing. It seemed to come from the rocks themselves, echoing up from deep within the canyon. Our satellite radio crackled to life on its own. Through the static, we could hear voices from what sounded like an old radio show, talking about a cattle drive in 1943. But between the words, there were other sounds, scratching, clicking, and something that sounded almost like whispers. Emily grabbed my arm. "Look," she pointed toward the canyon edge. In the growing darkness, I saw lights. Not flashlights or campfires, these were floating orbs of blue-white light, drifting up from the canyon depths like glowing bubbles. I've seen plenty of strange things in my rescue work, mirages, weather phenomena, even ball lightning. But this was different. These lights moved with purpose, like they were searching for something, or someone. We retreated to the RV, locked the doors, and pulled all the curtains shut. Neither of us said much, but we both kept our eyes on the windows. The humming continued all night, rising and falling like some giant creature breathing. I tried calling Ranger Mike on our emergency radio, but all we got was static and more of those weird old-time radio shows. It was like we'd somehow slipped into a different time, a different world. Emily spent hours writing in her research journal, trying to make sense of the changing rocks. I checked our emergency gear 3 times. We told ourselves there had to be logical explanations, but deep down we both knew we'd stumbled into something that logic couldn't explain. As I sat there in the dark, watching Emily finally drift off to sleep, I remembered something a Native American elder had once told me during a rescue operation. Some parts of the canyon don't belong to us. They belong to what came before and what's still waiting. I should have listened. We all should have listened. The next morning brought something that changed everything. While Emily was checking her rock samples, I decided to walk around our campsite. That's when I spotted it, an old RV, probably from the 1950s, half hidden behind some large rocks. It shouldn't have been there. The rangers hadn't mentioned any other vehicles in the area. "Emily," I called out, my voice sounding strangely muffled in the heavy air. "You need to see this." As we got closer, goosebumps spread across my arms. The RV looked perfect, too perfect for something that must have been sitting here for decades. No dust, no rust, no damaged parts. It was like it had been frozen in time. "Rick, look at the license plate," Emily whispered. "It's from 1952. The door wasn't locked. Inside, everything was exactly as if the owners had just stepped out for a minute. There was an old coffee pot on the small stove, 2 cups on the table, and a map spread out with notes scribbled on it. But what made my blood run cold was the diary we found, lying open on the small dining table. The last entry was dated the 21st of June, 1952. They're not birds. God help us, they're not birds at all. They come from the rocks themselves. The canyon is alive. If anyone finds this, do not stay after dark. The devils come when the sun sets. They're coming again. We can hear them scraping against the entry stopped mid-sentence. While we were reading, the temperature dropped suddenly. Our breath came out in white puffs in the middle of a summer day in the desert. The walls of the old RV creaked, and we heard that humming sound again, closer this time. "Rick," Emily's voice shook as she pointed to the window. Outside, the rocks were moving, not falling or sliding, actually moving, like they were breathing. And in the canyon below, something massive was casting a shadow that shouldn't have been possible with the sun's position. We ran back to our RV, but not before I grabbed the old diary. Inside our vehicle, Emily's hands trembled as she checked her rock samples again. The black stones from last night were now warm to the touch, and the strange patterns on them seemed to be changing, shifting like tiny moving mazes. The radio crackled to life again, but this time we heard a child's voice. "Mommy, the rock people are coming again." Then static, followed by what sounded like wings, huge wings, flapping against the air. Emily looked at me, her face pale. "Rick, yesterday I thought I was just seeing things, but those rock formations in my research area, they're different now. They've changed position. Rocks don't move by themselves." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that there had to be a logical explanation. But after what we'd just seen, after finding that RV, I knew we were in serious trouble. The sun was already starting to sink lower in the sky. We had maybe 3 hours of daylight left, and something told me we really didn't want to find out what happened after dark. That's when our RV's engine started on its own. The engine died as quickly as it had started, but that was just the beginning. What happened next is still hard for me to describe, but I'll try. We were sitting in the RV, trying to make sense of everything, when we first saw them. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the canyon, when something huge swooped past our window. At first, I thought it was a shadow, but shadows don't have wings. And shadows definitely don't have skin that looks like moving stone. "Did you see that?" Emily whispered, gripping my arm so tight it hurt. I nodded, unable to speak. The thing was circling back. This time, we got a clear look at it. It had a wingspan wider than our RV, with skin that looked like the canyon walls themselves. Its head was long and pointed, with eyes that glowed like hot coals. It wasn't a bird, wasn't a bat, wasn't anything I'd ever seen in my 15 years of rescue work. More of them appeared, rising from the canyon like dark clouds. They moved in ways that didn't make sense, sometimes flying, sometimes seeming to melt into the rocks themselves. We counted at least 6 of them. Then, the humming started again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just noise. It felt like the rocks were trying to talk. Emily, with her geology background, noticed it first. "Rick, these vibrations, they're patterns, like some kind of language." As if responding to her words, one of the creatures landed on a rock formation right in front of our RV. It turned its head to look at us, and I swear it was thinking. Planning. These things weren't just animals. They had intelligence in those glowing eyes. The temperature inside our RV started dropping again. Our breath came out in clouds, even though the desert outside was still baking hot. The creature outside tilted its head, and suddenly all our electronic devices went crazy. Phones, Emily's research equipment, everything just lighting up and shutting down. That's when we heard Ranger Linda's voice on our radio. "Harrison, if you can hear this, they're coming. The same things that took my team in '85. You need to." Static cut her off. The creature outside spread its wings, and the rock beneath it started to move, actually rise up like clay being shaped by invisible hands. Emily grabbed her journal and started writing frantically, trying to document everything. "Rick," she said, her voice shaking, "remember all those missing persons cases you worked on? The ones where people just vanished without a trace?" I nodded, already knowing where she was going with this. "I don't think they just got lost in the canyon," she whispered. "I think they were taken. By them." The sun had almost set now. The creatures were getting more active, moving closer to our RV. We could hear them scraping against the metal roof, testing for weak spots. They were hunting us. And the night was just beginning. What happened next was like a nightmare that wouldn't end. The creatures, these canyon devils as the old diary called them, surrounded our RV completely. They kept banging on the roof and walls, making dents in the metal that shouldn't have been possible. Emily and I huddled in the middle of the RV, watching as the windows began to frost over, in the middle of a desert summer. The humming got so loud it made our teeth hurt. Through the frosted windows, we could see their shadows moving, getting bigger and smaller, like they were changing shape. "The diary," Emily said suddenly, grabbing the old book we'd found. "Look at this." She pointed to a page we hadn't noticed before. There were drawings, rough sketches of the creatures, but also strange symbols that looked like the ones we'd seen on the rocks. Then something hit our RV so hard it rocked to one side. We heard a screech that sounded like metal being torn apart, but also like some kind of ancient language. The whole vehicle started to shake. "They're trying to get in," I whispered, holding Emily close. I'd never felt so helpless in all my rescue work. That's when Emily noticed something strange about her rock samples. They were glowing, pulsing, with the same rhythm as the humming outside. And the patterns on them. They were moving, forming shapes that matched the symbols in the diary. Suddenly, our radio crackled to life again. Through the static, we heard dozens of voices, old and new, some speaking English, others in languages we didn't understand. They were all crying for help, all trapped somehow. "Rick," Emily's voice was shaking. I think these things don't just take people. I think they take time itself." As if to prove her point, our watches started spinning wildly. The digital clock on our phones kept changing, showing dates from 19:21 minute, 20:30 the next. Outside, the sky couldn't seem to decide if it was night or day. The creatures were getting more aggressive. One of them pressed its face against our window, its stone-like skin shifting and changing, its eyes burning like fire. It opened its mouth, showing teeth made of crystal, and made a sound that made all our electronics explode in sparks. I grabbed our emergency flare gun, fat lot of good it would do against Livingstone, and pushed Emily toward the back of the RV. We had a small storage space there, hidden under the floor. It wasn't much, but it might buy us some time. Whatever happens, I told her, don't make a sound. We could hear them tearing at the roof now. Bits of metal and insulation started falling around us. The humming had turned into a kind of singing, beautiful but terrible, like a funeral song for the end of the world. And then, just as we thought it couldn't get worse, we heard a voice outside, a human voice. "Rick? Emily? It's Mike. Let me in. I know how to stop them." We looked at each other in the darkness. Should we trust him? Could it really be Ranger Mike out there? Or was it something else? Something wearing his voice like a disguise? We knew better than to answer that voice. Something about it wasn't quite right. It sounded like Mike, but also like something else trying to sound like him. The words had an echo that human voices shouldn't have. "Please," the voice called again. "They're coming. Let me in." Just then, Emily grabbed my arm. "Rick, look," she whispered, pointing to her research tablet that was somehow still working. The screen showed the temperature outside, dropping impossible fast, from 115 degrees to 20, then to below zero. Ice started forming on our windows, spreading like spiderwebs. Through the frost, I could see a shape that looked like Mike, but it kept changing. One moment it was human, the next it was tall and rocky, like the canyon devils. The humming changed to a deep rumble that shook our whole RV. Emily's rock samples started floating in the air, spinning like they were in some kind of dance. The symbols on them were glowing bright red now. "The diary?" Emily said suddenly, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. "Listen to this. They can copy us. They can become us. But they can't copy warmth. Living things are warm." That's when we heard real human voices, Ranger Linda and what sounded like a rescue team. But they weren't coming from outside. They were coming through our radio, from different times. June 1985. We've found something in the caves. October 1952. The rocks are moving again. August 2001. They're taking everyone. All these voices from different times, all trapped somehow in this strange place. The creatures had been doing this for years, maybe centuries, collecting people like butterflies in a case. The thing pretending to be Mike started pounding on our door. Each hit made the whole RV shake. Cracks started appearing in the walls, spreading like lightning bolts. We could hear the metal groaning, about to give way. Emily was still reading the diary frantically. "Rick, there's more. It says they guard something deep in the canyon, something older than time itself." The pounding stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Through the icy windows, we could see them all gathering, dozens of canyon devils, their stone skin shifting colors in the impossible darkness. Then, Emily found something in the diary that changed everything. Her face went white as she read it. "Oh God," she whispered. "They're not the guardians. They're the prison guards. And whatever they're guarding, it's waking up." The ground under our RV started to tremble. From deep below, deeper than the canyon itself, came a sound that made the humming seem like a whisper. It was like the whole world was cracking open. And we were right at the center of it all. The whole canyon started shaking like there was an earthquake. Cracks appeared in the ground, but these weren't normal cracks. They had that same strange pattern we'd seen on the rocks, and they were glowing with a deep red light. The canyon devils suddenly stopped attacking our RV. They all turned toward the canyon, like they were afraid of something. Even with their stone faces, we could tell they were scared. "Emily, what else does the diary say?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She read quickly. "The old Native American chief warned us. He said there's something ancient sleeping under the canyon. The rock creatures aren't the real threat. They're trying to keep it asleep. But every 100 years, it tries to wake up." The shaking got worse. Outside, the sky was doing impossible things. It was night, but we could see what looked like 3 suns, all different colors. Time wasn't just broken here, it was completely shattered. Then we heard Ranger Linda's voice again, this time clear and close. "Harrison, get out of the RV! Now!" We looked through the window and saw her running toward us with a flashlight. This time, we knew it was really her. She was breathing hard and her footsteps left marks in the ground. The fake mic was gone. "Run!" she shouted. "It's breaking free!" We grabbed the diary, Emily's research, and my emergency pack, then burst out of the RV. The air outside felt wrong, too thick, like we were underwater. The canyon devils were flying in circles overhead, their stone wings scraping against each other. Linda reached us, out of breath. "I've seen this before in '85, she gasped. "But it wasn't this bad. We have to get to the caves." "What caves?" I asked. But then I saw them, openings in the canyon wall that definitely hadn't been there before. They had the same symbols we'd seen on the rocks, glowing like neon signs. The ground cracked open between us and our RV. The crack was so deep we couldn't see the bottom, and that red light was pouring out of it like blood. "The caves are safe," Linda explained as we ran. "The rock creatures made them as shelters. They're not evil. They're trying to protect us from what's down there." Emily stopped suddenly. "Listen." From deep below came a sound that made my heart stop, like a massive creature taking its first breath after a very long sleep. The canyon devils started making those singing sounds again, but now it sounded like they were trying to sing something back to sleep. We reached the caves just as the ground split wide open. Our RV fell into the crack, disappearing into that red light. And then we saw it, something huge, rising from the depths, something that shouldn't exist in our world or any other. Linda pulled us into the cave. "Quick, we have to seal it." Inside the cave, Linda showed us what to do. The walls had handprints carved into them, and when we placed our hands there, the rock started to glow. The cave entrance sealed itself, just as something massive passed by outside. "What is that thing?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. Linda took a deep breath. "Something ancient. Something that was here long before humans. The canyon devils, they were created to keep it asleep. Every 100 years, during the summer solstice, it tries to wake up." The cave walls were covered in glowing pictures that told a story. They showed the creature, something so big it made the canyon devils look tiny. The picture showed how it had been trapped underground, with the canyon devils as its guards. "But why is it waking up now?" I asked. Emily's face went pale as she looked at her research notes. "The new mining operations. They've been digging deeper into the canyon. We must have disturbed something." The ground shook again, and we heard that terrible sound, like a mountain yawning. Through small cracks in the cave wall, we could see what was happening outside. The canyon devils were flying around the huge shape, hitting it with beams of light from their eyes. "They're trying to put it back to sleep," Linda explained. "But they need help. That's why they've been taking people. They need human energy, human time, to keep it locked away." Emily opened the old diary again. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a page. "It's some kind of spell or chant. The diary says it can help the canyon devils." The cave started humming, matching the song of the creatures outside. We could feel it in our bones, in our blood. Linda started humming too. She knew the tune from her experience in '85. "If we don't help them," she said, "that thing will wake up completely. And if it does, it won't just be the Grand Canyon that's in danger. It'll be everything." Emily and I looked at each other. We could feel time shifting around us, possibilities opening and closing. We had a choice to make. "The diary says there's a price," Emily said quietly. "Anyone who helps has to stay, become part of the guardian force. That's what happened to all those missing people. They didn't disappear. They chose to stay." Another crash from outside made us jump. Through the cracks, we could see the huge shape getting clearer, more solid. The canyon devils were losing the fight. Linda looked at us sadly. "I stayed in '85. Been helping them ever since. Now you have to choose too." Emily squeezed my hand, and I knew what she was thinking. After all we'd seen, we couldn't just walk away. The humming was getting louder, and through the cracks in the cave wall, we could see the sky turning a deep, angry red. "We'll help," I said. Emily nodded, holding the diary tight. Linda showed us what to do. We had to place our hands on different symbols on the cave wall and join in the humming. It felt strange at first, like trying to sing a song you've never heard but somehow know by heart. As we hummed, something incredible happened. The cave walls became transparent, like glass, and we could see everything outside. The canyon devils were still fighting, their stone wings glowing with ancient power. The thing they were fighting was bigger than anything I'd ever seen, like a mountain made of darkness and stars. "Now!" Linda shouted over the noise. "Read the words from the diary." Emily started reading. The words weren't in English or any language I knew, but somehow we could all speak them. As we chanted, our bodies started feeling lighter, like we were becoming part of the air itself. The canyon devils heard us. They turned toward our cave, their eyes glowing brighter. Suddenly, I could understand them. They weren't monsters, they were protectors, as ancient as the canyon itself, and they were tired. They needed our help. The huge creature roared, shaking the whole canyon. But now, the canyon devils were stronger. Our chanting was giving them power. Their stone skin started glowing with the same symbols from the cave walls. "It's working!" Linda shouted. "Keep going!" I felt something pulling at me, like a gentle wind trying to lift me up. Emily was glowing now, her hand in mine starting to feel like warm stone. We were changing, becoming something else, something that could help guard this ancient secret. The massive creature started sinking back into the ground, forced down by the combined power of our chant and the canyon devils. As it disappeared, I saw all the missing people, not gone, but changed, flying with stone wings among the ancient guardians. That's when I understood. We weren't just helping to save the world, we were joining an ancient army of protectors. The Grand Canyon wasn't just a place, it was a prison, a fortress, and now it would be our home. The last thing I remember as a normal human was Emily's smile as we both changed, our skin turning to living stone, wings growing from our backs. It wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. And now, we're still here, watching, protecting. When you visit the Grand Canyon and feel like something's watching you, you're right, we are. When you hear strange humming on quiet nights, that's us, singing the ancient songs that keep the world safe. Just remember, some mysteries are meant to stay mysteries. Some secrets need guardians. And sometimes, the best way to save the world is to become something more than human. So here I am, writing this story on what looks like paper, but is actually thin layers of living stone. If you're reading this, you found one of the many warnings we leave for those who wander too close to our secrets. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I see tourists at the canyon's edge, taking pictures of the sunset. They don't notice when their cameras catch glimpses of us flying past, or when their phones pick up our ancient songs. Emily and I are different now, but still together. Our stone wings have grown strong, and we've learned to shift between human form and guardian form when needed. Linda was right. It's not a curse, but a duty, a purpose bigger than ourselves. Sometimes, new rangers notice their radios picking up strange voices, or tourists report seeing impossible things in the canyon. The official reports call them mirages or tricks of light, but we know better. We're still here, along with all the others who chose to stay, keeping watch, protecting the world from what lies beneath. If you ever visit the Grand Canyon and feel a sudden chill or hear a strange humming in the rocks, don't be afraid. It's just us doing our job. But if you see the rocks starting to move, or notice the sky turning that deep, unnatural red, run. Run fast, run far. Or maybe, if you're like us, if you feel that pull in your heart to be part of something ancient and important, maybe you'll stay. The canyon always needs more guardians, and the old songs always welcome new voices. Just remember, not all who wander into the Grand Canyon are lost. Some of us are exactly where we need to be. My name is Marcus Whitaker, and what I'm about to tell you happened back in 1977. I still get chills thinking about those 6 days in the Mogollon Rim. You know, sometimes I wish I could just forget everything. But then I look at my son Tommy's face and my wife Lucy's eyes, and I know we'll never be the same again. I used to be a forest ranger before switching to wildlife photography. Pretty big change, right? But I loved capturing nature's beauty through my lens. Lucy, my brilliant wife, is a botanist. She studies plants and all that green stuff. And then there's our son Tommy, who was 12 at the time. Smart kid, always seemed to know things before they happened. Guess that turned out to be more important than we thought. It all started when we bought this second-hand RV. A 1976 GMC Palm Beach motorhome. Beautiful thing, cream-colored with brown stripes. Got it for a steal, though now I know why. Should have asked more questions about those weird scratch marks inside. But hey, hindsight's always perfect, isn't it? We were planning this big family trip to the Mogollon Rim in Arizona. Lucy wanted to study some rare plants, and I had a magazine assignment to photograph the wilderness. Tommy, well, he was just excited about camping in our new RV. The day we left, we stopped at this old gas station to fill up. That's where we met old Joe Martinez. I'll never forget his weathered face and those knowing eyes. While filling our tank, he started telling us stories about the land, ancient tribal grounds, sacred places, and warnings about things that shouldn't be disturbed. Some things out there, he said, his voice getting real quiet, they ain't what they seem. They can wear your face, speak with your voice. The old ones called them skinwalkers. Tommy got real quiet after that. He kept tugging at my sleeve, saying maybe we should go somewhere else. But I didn't listen. I mean, who believes in old legends these days, right? Man, what a fool I was. We reached our campsite just as the sun was setting. It was a beautiful spot, tucked away between tall pine trees, far from any other campers. The moment we parked the RV, Tommy froze at the door. "Dad," he whispered, "something doesn't feel right here." I brushed it off, thinking he was just spooked by old Joe's stories. Lucy was already outside, excited about some weird circle of plants she'd found. "Marcus, come, look at this," she called. "I've never seen plants grow in such a perfect circle before." As I set up my camera equipment, I noticed how quiet it was. No birds chirping, no squirrels running around, just dead silence. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. That's when I first heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from the RV's roof. Probably just tree branches, I told myself, but deep down, I knew there weren't any branches hanging that low. That first night, none of us slept well. The scratching continued on and off, and Tommy kept saying he could hear whispers in the dark. I tried to convince him it was just the wind, but even I didn't believe that anymore. When morning came, I found something that made my blood run cold. There were claw marks on the trees around our campsite. Not like bear claws, these were different. They were too big, too deliberate. And then I saw the footprints in the mud. 18 inches long, they looked almost human, but wrong somehow. I tried taking pictures of the footprints, but every time I checked my camera, the photos came out black, just solid black. All my equipment was acting weird, batteries draining in minutes, lenses fogging up for no reason. Tommy stuck close to me all morning. "Dad," he said, his voice shaking, "I can hear them talking. They're using words I don't understand, but they're getting closer." I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but Lucy insisted we stay. She was fascinated by those plant circles, said they couldn't have formed naturally. If only we'd listened to Tommy. That's when we saw it for the first time, just a glimpse through the trees. Something tall, much taller than any person should be, moving between the shadows. And those eyes, those glowing yellow eyes. The next morning, things got worse, much worse. I woke up to find our food storage completely torn apart. Not like animals had gotten to it, everything was shredded, like something was looking for something specific. The weird thing was, our RV doors were still locked from the inside. While cleaning up the mess, Tommy tugged at my sleeve. "Dad," he whispered, pointing through the window, "there's another RV out there." I grabbed my flashlight, and sure enough, About 100 yards into the woods, there was an abandoned RV. It looked just like ours, same model, same year. My hands were shaking as I approached it. The door was hanging open, and inside, inside there was blood, lots of it. Dried brown stains all over the walls and ceiling. That's when our radio started making weird noises. Instead of static, we heard chanting, deep, rhythmic sounds that made no sense. Tommy's face went white. He started shaking and then, out of nowhere, developed a high fever. But what really scared me was when he started speaking in a language I'd never heard before. Lucy tried to calm him down, but then she went outside to get some medicine from the car. She was only supposed to be gone for a minute. 1 minute turned into 6 hours. When she finally came back, something was different. She couldn't remember where she'd been. She acted normal, but Tommy just stared at her and started crying. "That's not Mom," he whispered to me when Lucy wasn't looking. "It looks like her, but it's not her." I thought he was just delirious from the fever until I checked my camera. I'd been taking pictures all day, and in some of them, I saw Lucy in places she couldn't have been. In one photo, she was standing by our RV, but in the next shot, taken seconds later, she was deep in the woods, staring directly at the camera with eyes that seemed to glow. That's when we saw it clearly for the first time. Standing at the edge of our campsite was this thing. It must have been 8 feet tall, with limbs too long for its body. It looked almost human, but wrong in every way possible. And its face kept shifting, like it couldn't decide what it wanted to look like. Then it spoke, with Lucy's voice. I tried to start the RV, but it was completely dead. We were trapped. That night was the worst. They surrounded us. Yes, there wasn't just one anymore. I counted at least 3 of these creatures, these skinwalkers, circling our RV. The scariest part was how they could just walk through walls, like ghosts, but much more real, much more terrifying. They'd appear inside the RV, standing in corners watching us. Then they'd just melt back through the walls when I tried to confront them. Tommy was curled up in his bed, muttering something over and over. When I got closer, I realized he was saying, "There's 2 of everyone now. 2 moms, 2 dads. Which ones are real?" That's when the Lucy who'd returned earlier turned to me and smiled. But it wasn't Lucy's smile. It was too wide, showing too many teeth. "Marcus," she said, but her voice echoed like 2 people were speaking at once. "Don't you want to know where your real wife is?" My hands were shaking as I pointed my flashlight at her. In the beam, her shadow wasn't human. It was tall and twisted, with long claws and that horrible stretched-out face. Tommy suddenly sat up straight, his eyes wide. "Dad, Mom's in the cave. The real Mom. They've had her since day 3. The fake Lucy's face began to change. It was like watching clay melt and reshape itself. I grabbed Tommy and backed away, but we were running out of space in the RV. Outside, the other creatures were pressing against the windows, their faces morphing between human and something else. "You have to shoot it, Dad," Tommy said quietly. "It's not Mom. Mom's in the cave." I reached for my hunting rifle, the one I always brought for emergencies. The fake Lucy lunged at us, its body twisting in ways no human body should move. I had to make a choice. My son was watching. The creature was getting closer. And somewhere out there, in a cave, my real wife was waiting for us. I took the shot. The sound of the rifle was deafening inside the RV. The thing that looked like Lucy fell back, but instead of blood, its skin started to peel away like old wallpaper. Underneath wasn't flesh. It was something dark and shifting, like shadows made solid. "We have to run now," Tommy said, pulling my arm. "I know where Mom is. I can feel her." We burst out of the RV into the darkness. The other creatures were right behind us, but Tommy led the way like he could see in the dark. We ran through the trees, branches scratching our faces. I could hear them following us, not just running, but moving through the trees themselves. The cave Tommy led us to was hidden behind some rocks. "Mom," he called out. "Mom, we're here." We found Lucy tied up with some kind of vine, weak but alive. When she saw us, she started crying. "They've been pretending to be me," she whispered. "I've been watching them live my life." But we weren't safe yet. The creatures gathered at the cave entrance, blocking our way out. That's when Tommy did something incredible. He started speaking in that strange language again. But this time it was different. He wasn't scared anymore. He was commanding them. "What are you doing?" I asked him. "The words just came to me, Dad," he said. "Old Joe told me in my dreams last night. It's an ancient protection ritual. They can't hurt us if we say these words." The creatures started backing away. Their bodies were shifting, becoming less human-like, more like shadows. Tommy kept chanting, his voice getting stronger. With each word, they seemed to fade a little more. Lucy held onto my arm as we watched our son face down these ancient beings. The air felt electric, like during a thunderstorm. And then, with one final word from Tommy, the creatures vanished, not like smoke, but like they were being pulled back into the shadows of the forest. The strange electric feeling in the air disappeared, and suddenly we could hear normal forest sounds again, crickets chirping, wind in the trees. We ran back to our RV, holding on to each other tight. Lucy was weak but could walk. The sun was just starting to rise when we got there. Without saying a word, I jumped into the driver's seat, and this time, the engine started right up. As we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. What I saw makes me shiver even today. There we were, our family, standing at the campsite, waving goodbye. A perfect copy of me, Lucy, and Tommy, smiling those two wide smiles. That was 4 years ago. We've tried to move on, but things are different now. Tommy, he has this gift. Or maybe it's a curse. He can sense things others can't. Sometimes he wakes up screaming, saying they're watching us. Lucy still has nightmares. Some nights, she wakes up speaking in that strange language. As for me, I developed all the photos from that trip. Most were black, but a few came out clear. In them, I can see the truth. Shadows where there shouldn't be shadows, faces in the trees, and most disturbing of all, multiple versions of us in the same picture. We never went camping again, but sometimes, on dark nights, we hear scratching on our roof. And Tommy just looks at us and says, "They're still out there, Dad. They're just waiting." I still don't know exactly what those things were. Maybe they were the ancient guardians old Joe warned us about. Maybe they're still there in the Mogollon Rim, waiting for the next family who doesn't listen to warnings. But I do know one thing. Whenever I see a perfect family photo now, I look very carefully. Because sometimes, if you look close enough, the smiles are just a little too wide, and the shadows don't fall quite right.